In this chapter, we'll be discussing children and adolescents in sport and exercise, and really the benefits that children and adolescents can get from exercise. Growth and development will be something we'll talk about, and we'll also differentiate that from maturity and maturation. Then we'll discuss acute and chronic adaptations to exercise, and then how we can maybe change the physical activity patterns among youth, and then talk about some special issues for kids, specifically exercising in warm or cold, or using resistance training to benefit their overall performance. So growth is going to be an increase in body size, parts of the body, while development is differentiation and function changes that occur when you go from infancy to adulthood. Maturation is also going to be a process that combines both of these things, and typically you'll see this process, that maturation to adulthood, coming in three different ways to describe it. So you got chronological age, skeletal age, and the stage of sexual maturation. If we're looking at sexual maturation as a way to determine overall age, you can look at Tanner stage to determine this. So you can see from the description, there are differing stages of maturation that you can expect based on the sexual characteristics. So once you get to an adult, you have that full maturation, full reproductivity for both males and for females, along with the axillary hair that's present, and then sweat and sebaceous glands being very active. When we put all three of these together, we can come up with differing ways to determine and classify individuals from birth to adulthood. And so if we look at infancy, that is going to be the first year of life. I currently have all four of my children no longer in infancy. My youngest just had her first birthday, so she is out of the infancy and now into the childhood stage. So childhood goes from first birthday till puberty, and then the onset of those secondary sex characteristics, like we just talked about in the Tanner stage classification, would be puberty up through growth completion. That is going to give us that adolescent stage for children to adolescence. There are some interesting things to look at with children and adolescents and the onset of puberty. So you can see that with growth and development of tissues, there's going to be significant growth rates at 2 points in time. The first is going to be within that first 2 years of life. So you can see significant growth, that rate of change in height, centimeters per year. You can see you're increasing significantly, but then that levels off after 2 years. So it's slow, still growing, but not as drastic as it would in that first 2 years. So again, when you have a baby that's born up until its first birthday, they change so much because, again, this rate of change in height and weight are so great. At the onset of puberty, that's also when we start to see the increase in peak height, velocity, and then weight is going to happen about 6 months after the fact. So we have mid-puberty to late teens being slow again, but at the onset of puberty, we have that peak height and weight change happening fast again. Okay, and so if we look at the synchronization between height and weight, we're about half a year off for both of these. And also, if you notice, around 12 years is when girls have that peak height velocity starting to elevate, while boys have that about 2 years later. So around that 12-year-old range, you'll see girls are taller than boys, but then after that, the girls' epiphyseal plates close sooner. And because boys were at this elevated change of height for a little bit longer than girls were, overall, boys are going to be taller than girls, or males will be taller than females when you get to adulthood. So as I alluded to, when you have this onset of these sex-determining hormones, you can have bone ossification that starts to occur. So what you have is you have a growth plate that is going to continue to expand and elongate the long bones. So it's a cartilage line in the bone. And when you become an adult, from a bone side of things, you can measure adulthood by the growth or closure of the epiphyseal plate, or that ossification portion. So again, when we have plate closure, In girls, that's going to be stimulated by estrogen. So full bone maturity happens in your mid-teens, which is why it's extremely important if you're a female or if you have girls in your house before puberty to get as much calcium and phosphorus in their body as possible so that they have strong bones and that bone growth can be facilitated because that full bone maturity is going to happen in the mid-teens. Whereas boys, that can be into the early 20s. And that calcium is going to be, like I said, essential for bone mineral density and to stave off osteoporosis later on in life, specifically for females. Here we can see the changes in bone mineral density throughout the female lifespan. You can see that there's a decline after age 50 that is less precipitous for men compared to women. So after menopause is when you see a significant decline in this. So again, if we're looking at overall density, you want to save up as much as you possibly can for females earlier on so that if you do have a decline, that it's going to be not so much that it actually pushes you into osteopenia or osteoporosis. Interestingly enough, we also have muscle mass that steadily is going to be increasing as we continue to put weight on, going from infancy to adulthood. We have 25% of our body weight at birth, that's muscle mass. By the time a young woman has fully matured due to estrogen, we've got that up to 35% of the body weight. But males are going to, due to testosterone, have 45% of their body weight that is muscle mass. So again, if you're comparing these two, it's really an unfair advantage that you have because there's going to be more mass per body weight for males compared to females that is related to muscle mass. And if we look at the peaks, this is going to peak around 20 years of age for females, while males can be having this up to 25 years. So even after college, you can still have that growth and development of muscle that happens. And again, we see this bifurcation that's occurring due to the onset of sex determining hormones, estrogen and testosterone that happens at puberty. During normal growth and development, even without exercise, kids can be expected to have fiber hypertrophy occur. With fiber hypertrophy, you'll see increases in muscle mass. You'll have more and longer sarcomeres that will also increase the muscle length. Again, this makes sense because as the bones are elongating, the muscle also has to elongate as well. You also will see fat depositions that were formed in the fetus and then throughout life that are affected by a few different factors that you can or cannot control. Obviously, diet and exercise are going to be things that you can control, but fat depositions are going to be formed also based on heredity. That's something that you can't change. But again, worry about the changeable things, don't worry about the non-changeable things, and hopefully that'll equal out in the wash in the end. Okay, and so at the percent of 10 to 12%, that's how much fat we see on a baby that is born. But once we get to physical maturity, that can be between 15 and 25%, depending on if we're looking at men or women. It can be even obviously bigger than that, as we talked about in the obesity chapter, where it could be 40, 45% if you have someone that has significant body composition dysfunction occurring. As there's growth, development, and maturation happening in children into adolescence and into adulthood, you can expect neurological development to also occur. So as the children grow, they develop better balance, agility, and coordination. And this is due in part to myelination of nerve fibers, and that has to happen and be completed for fast reactions and skilled movements. So as children will grow and develop, their myelination of their axons will occur so that you can have a greater speed of that impulse, that action potential traveling down to the axon terminal. Without that, you can't really have very myelinated and speed communication for that balance and agility and coordination one would expect in higher level sports performance. The myelination of the cerebral cortex also is going to occur most rapidly in childhood, but will continue beyond into puberty and beyond. So for the full development of reaction speed and motor skills, that depends on the completion of this myelination process. And if we are again myelinating all these alpha motor neurons that are attached to the type 1, type 2A, and type 2X muscle fibers, we can also see an improvement in muscle strength. Now, when we're looking at kids and adolescents and their response to exercise, what's actually happening can be compounded and described in strength, cardiovascular and respiratory function, as well as the metabolic function. So what happens to kids as they go from rest to exercise for an acute bout of activity is what will be described in the coming slides. So for strength, we see an increase in strength as muscle mass increases with age. So comparing a 6-year-old to a 16-year-old is not fair because strength is going to improve just naturally over time. You see that, again, we're peaking around 20 years of age for women and between 20 and 30 years of age for men. The strength, power, and skill that's required for activities is going to be improving with myelination, and that peak performance is going to require, obviously, neural maturity and development. Boys are going to be experiencing a marked change around 12 years of age, while girls experience a change in strength and power that's more gradual and linear. This, again, is going to be partially due to the body composition, with more emphasis on fat and less emphasis on muscle mass compared to boys. In this figure, we're seeing leg strength gains in boys that have been followed over a longitudinal process. So we've got 8-year-old compared to 18-year-old. In that curve, you can see that there's a significant strength gain in just based off of age. So this increase in the slope occurs from age 12 to age 16. You can see that the rate of this all of a sudden jumps significantly. That is going to be, again, based on and related to the testosterone and puberty onset. In this figure, we're seeing a comparison between boys and girls and strength expressed as a composite static strength score from several strength testing sites. These data are expressed in the form of kilograms of body mass to account for differences in size. So we're seeing that there's less of a difference pre-puberty and at puberty onset, but once we are ending puberty and post-puberty, there's a greater difference or bifurcation, a dichotomy, if you will, between boys and girls, with boys having a stronger, higher static score compared to girls. Moving on to the cardiovascular response to acute exercise in children, we see that resting and submaximal blood pressure is going to be lower than adults because there's a smaller body size and there's less blood overall. So the overall blood pressure at rest and submaximally is going to be lower. We also have smaller hearts, so the force that's being generated is less, and lower peripheral resistance during exercise. Now, resting and submaximal stroke volumes will also be lower because we have smaller hearts and not as much blood, but the heart rate is going to be higher than for adults because kids have a higher heart rate at max. And so to make the exact same cardiac output for, let's just say, running at 5 miles an hour, if you have a significantly smaller stroke volume, you have to have a significantly higher heart rate. So overall, this produces a slightly lower cardiac output than an adult. And to compensate for that, the arterial venous O2 difference is going to be greater for kids than it will be for an adult to, again, help with that compensation for the slightly lower cardiac output. Here we're seeing those differences, again, related to stroke volume, heart rate, and cardiac output. This is a great example of a great musical group, Boys to Men, right? You're comparing Boys to Men. That stroke volume for boys, significantly lower because smaller hearts. So they have to compensate for that with a significantly higher heart rate. The combination of both of these, heart rate times stroke volume, is going to lead to cardiac output, but notice that we're having a slight difference for boys compared to men. However, that slight difference in cardiac output is made up here with the AVO2 difference being greater or higher for children, boys, compared to adults or men in this research study. So you can see that for the exact same oxygen uptake, so if we have to have 1 liter of oxygen, we are actually going to draw more out of the system if we're a child compared to an adult. When we get to the maximal type of exercise, in children, we're going to see higher heart rates compared to adults. Again, if you look at the 220 minus your age, you can see that if you're a younger person, you're going to have a higher estimated heart rate max, and kids do have higher heart rate maxes compared to adults. However, their maximum stroke volume will be significantly lower because they have smaller heart sizes. Maximal cardiac output will thus be lower as well. And this is going to limit performance because it's going to allow for less oxygen to be delivered for children compared to adults. This is not a serious limitation when we're looking at relative workloads, so taking that per kilogram body weight, but it is a limitation if we're looking at absolute workloads, like running at 8 miles an hour. Moving on to lung function, we have differences in lung volumes because, again, size. Kids are smaller, they have smaller thoracic cavities, they're going to have smaller lungs than an adult will. As they continue to grow, their lung size will increase. Post-puberty, girls' absolute values are going to be lower than boys, though, due to smaller body size. Again, if you remember that peak height velocity and overall closing of the epiphyseal plates happens earlier for girls, so typically the thoracic cavity is going to be smaller, creating a smaller lung size. Metabolic function, we're seeing that increase as well with age. This relates to, again, increases in muscle mass, strength, and cardiorespiratory function that's going to occur as you continue to mature, develop, and grow. The modifications of the cardiorespiratory system are obviously trying to meet the demands for exercise in that acute bout of activity. If we compare the values for boys and girls from an absolute and a relative term, you can see that cardiorespiratory changes with age will permit greater delivery of O2. So if we look at the VO2 max in liters per minute, this is an absolute value. This increases with age. So as boys and girls grow, their overall oxygen that they can consume increases. Again, mainly due to lung size, heart size, blood volume, and all of that. The VO2 max, though, in milliliters per kilogram per minute remains steady with boys because, again, you're going to see an increase in fat-free mass, whereas girls are going to see a decline in this with age, and that fat-free mass is going to be included in this, but we're also seeing an increase in fat mass that's going to be disproportional compared to boys. So overall, we see a decline with age in girls of their VO2 max. Now, you might actually see this practically if you look at cross-country runners specifically in high school and in middle school. What you see is the younger middle school to like 9th or 10th grade, girls are going to be the ones that are, placing at meets, at state. They're the ones that are doing that. And the ones that are, sophomores, juniors, seniors, if they've been going through puberty, they've increased their estrogen, they increase their fat mass, they'll most likely not be as elite in that sophomore, junior, senior because of that extra fat that they're carrying. Whereas boys, you rarely see a middle schooler placing in state or in the top for any of these things, unless they're heredity gifted with amazing genes. But you see like the sophomores, juniors, and seniors, the ones that are increasing their VO2 max, that are actually the ones that are increasing in their performance and winning all the meets. So it may be more appropriate to measure in liters per minute during growth year than for milliliters per kilogram per minute when we're looking at boys versus girls. Another difficult part to determine with children, adolescents, and that age gap is that there's constantly body composition changes in height and weight. So it's difficult to determine what their absolute value and what their VO2 max should be. So VO2 max relative to body weight is going to differ from the absolute values. And you can see that in the next figure. So to try and reduce the effect of body size on the data, you may want to use something to scale that data, like maybe body surface area or weight, and use that to a specific power. Here you can see we're comparing, again, the absolute and relative changes in VO2 max with age for boys and for girls. You can see, again, that around the red line where puberty is, that vertical line, we're having a bifurcation or a dichotomy response that's occurring here, where girls have the slight improvement and boys are as well. And then once you have puberty hitting, the absolute value kind of levels off for girls, but continues to increase for boys, again, because the epiphyseal plate doesn't close quite as quick. And then you have testosterone increasing fat-free mass. And then we have that VO2 max in milliliters per kilogram per minute declining after puberty while remaining constant after puberty for girls compared to boys. Another interesting thing to note with children's response to acute exercise is that they aren't very efficient, so they have a lower economy of effort compared to an adult. Children are going to consume a lot more oxygen per kilogram than an adult will, but with age, as their skills improve and their stride length improves, so they have longer legs, longer limbs, they know how to run, know how to move their body through space, they'll increase their economy of effort. If we look at the endurance running pace, that will also increase with age. And this is purely a result of economy of effort, and that children are becoming, again, more in tune, their body's figuring out how to do things neurologically speaking. And so regardless of VO2 max changes and training status, they'll become better equipped to perform endurance activities. And this table is not in your text, but I like to include it because this shows the excessive metabolic cost of locomotion for children. What that means is at an 18-year-old, this is how much oxygen it takes, and then everything is compared to that. So you can see as a 17-year-old, it's a 3% more excessive cost. So they're having to run at 103%. If you compare this to a 5-year-old, they are consuming 37% more oxygen than the 18-year-old version. So there's this economy of effort that is going to be increasing, becoming more efficient, and there's a greater cost of locomotion per kilogram body weight for children than there is for young adults. So we've been discussing what happens for aerobic activity, that acute aerobic activity and exercise in children up to adolescence. But children are also going to have limited anaerobic performance compared to adults. You're going to have a lower glycolytic capacity in the muscle because you have less muscle glycogen, less storage of that. Blood lactate is going to be lower. You have less glycolytic enzymatic activity, again, because less muscle glycogen, all of that. And then you have increases in mean and peak power that will come with age. So as you continue to get older, your muscle size grows, your enzymatic activity increases, blood lactate level is going to be increasing as well. So you have a better capacity to work anaerobically as you continue to get older. The resting stores of the ATP-PCR are similar in children as they are to adults. Here we're looking at a figure that's comparing the age and sex-related differences for optimal peak performance. And this is adjusted for body mass. So you're comparing males and females. Preteen, it's again very similar for that peak power comparatively. But once we get to the teen and adulthood, there's a significant dichotomy between the two, with males being able to generate a lot more peak power even after weight has been adjusted compared to females. And in this figure, we're looking at the maximal energy expenditure relating boys and girls for different systems. So we've got the anaerobic, that's going to be the dashed line, and the aerobic, that's the solid line. Notice that from 10 years to 16 years, boys aerobically are holding basically the same. So their maximal energy expenditure is holding constant through puberty, while girls actually are having a higher ability earlier on that then drops off. So again, this is where that sweet spot of, cross-country runners, aerobically speaking, would be coming out of middle school for females, but would be coming out of high school for males as their peak performers. Notice also that anaerobically, both boys and girls are going to be increasing, but boys haven't met their 100% max yet, even after 16, while girls have met that because, again, their development and maturation has kind of concluded by the end of puberty earlier on. We also have an endocrine response that is going to be consistent for children compared to adults. So it's going to, again, have surges in those growth hormones and insulin-like growth factors for kids compared to adults. Those are going to be higher when exercising. So if you needed any reason for your kids to get out and play and not sit in front of a TV or be sedentary, one of those main reasons is your endocrine response to exercise is going to be greater than it is as an adult. You have increased stress response to exercise than an adult, so you can see significant growth improvements and changes metabolically, skeletal muscle wise, endocrine wise, in children that are exercising and being active. Hypoglycemia is also going to be present at exercise because of that response of insulin. Glucagon may be a little underdeveloped for kids compared to adults. The substrate use is also going to be more reliant on fat than carbohydrate for kids compared to adults. So they may need a high amount of exogenous glucose use, so stopping for breaks, having a snack. Kids need lots of snacks, and if you have kids, which I do, I have 4 kids, they're always wanting snacks. So again, it makes sense because they need glucose. They don't have lots of storage space for it when they're younger, and they're relying more on fat oxidation. So if they're wanting to do higher intensity activities, they have to use glucose, but I got to take that in that exogenous way. All right, so adaptations we can expect from training and exercise for kids. Children's acute responses are going to be different from adults, and their training needs are also going to be different. So you don't necessarily have to have kids lose weight or try and build muscle or have maximal oxygen consumption because they're naturally going to do those things as it is. But there may be some benefits that are coming in each of these different phases for kids that are performing chronic exercise training. First, we'll talk about body weight and composition. So the response to physical activity and exercise is going to be similar as it is for an adult. Typically, you'll see increases in fat-free mass and lower weight and fat mass when children are training and when adolescents are training. A key piece to this as well is significant bone growth can be generated. So because you're having the endocrine system, increases in human growth hormone, IGF-1, all of those different hormones that can lead and facilitate bone growth. So it would be beneficial to have kids exercising if you wanted to see significant bone growth, and especially if you have small girls, children. Those kids are going to be benefiting well from exercise because you can save up more and more of that phosphorus and calcium in the bones to increase rigidity and have increased bone health. Strength-wise, this has been obviously historically controversial. Most people were probably told you can't be doing resistance training as a kid. You're going to stunt your growth, doing this and that. But weightlifting has been actually pretty safe for kids as long as it is supervised and appropriately prescribed. If you look at the ACSM or NASM, lots of different places have prescription for what would be safe and appropriate for differing ages. And they're not all going to be, in a squat rack benching or squatting 200, 300 pounds as like a 7-year-old. That's obviously not appropriate. The main thing that you want to look at for children is you want to see strength gains that are going to be mainly coming through the neurological mechanisms. So having that synchronous contraction, recruiting more motor units, doing a better job of activating that neuromuscular junction and so on. That's going to be where kids are going to see their increase in strength, not so much hypertrophy coming from resistance training. Adolescents, though, on the other hand, are going to be gaining both neurological and hypertrophic responses to resistance training, which would be appropriate for them. But again, it has to be tailored to them, to their ability, and really working on technique first. So as previously stated, resistance training is going to be appropriate for children, adolescents, for adults. It can be similar to that, but obviously the weight is going to be significantly different. How you're doing it may also be different. So like instead of using a barbell for my 5-year-old, I might just want to have them squat in the air or have resistance bands or something similar to that. So the emphasis is more on proper lifting technique and not so much on how much weight can be lifted. Switching to aerobic training, children will have little to no change in their VO2 max outside of their growth and maturation that we just talked about previously that happens with age. Performance does increase though due to improved running economy. So if they become trained in that ability to run, then that neurological ability, coordination, balance, agility, all of that can improve overall ability to run. So performance will improve, but it's not necessarily dependent on VO2 max improving. Children that are benefiting from aerobic training will have that, but aerobic training in adolescents we'll see marked changes in VO2 max. And this is, again, likely due to increases in heart size and stroke volume that occur with continued growth from childhood to adolescence. Anaerobically speaking, there are going to be significant effects that happen in children as well. So you can see an increase in maximal blood lactate, an increase in phosphofructokinase or PFK, that activity, which again, if you remember back, is part of the bioenergetics chapter, specifically in glycolysis. It's the rate limiting enzyme. You also see increases in resting PCR, ATP, and glycogen in children that are doing anaerobic training. So if you're using adult anaerobic training programs with children and adolescents, that's okay, but you have to be conservative so that you are not risking overtraining, loss of interest, or injury in these kids. So the main thing I would say when you are training or trying to, have kids, raise kids, interact with kids, and have exercise implemented, you want to have them find something that they love to do. So a couple of my kids love to do dance. A couple of my kids have been figuring out, do they want to do soccer or t-ball or baseball or, lots of different interests. Do they want to play hockey? You want to just give them the opportunity to explore these activities and find something that they like to do, or allow them to do multiple things that they enjoy doing so that you have that built into them earlier on. So hopefully they'll continue to exercise and be physically active as they get older. An ancillary benefit that's connected to exercise training is cognitive function. Specifically in kids, if we look at physical activity, there seems to be an influence on cognitive skills, their attitudes, and academic behaviors. So if they're physically active, one can also expect to have a correlation with better attitudes in school, better behavior academically, and it may be related to that energy that is expended and then become a little bit more tired and a little bit more docile, if you will, in the classroom. So it's unfortunate that a number of schools have dropped the physical activity education portion, or maybe even dropped recess, hoping that they could stuff more academically in. But there really probably should be some policy changes to instead support and fund physical activity programs so that the benefits of that could be seen in the classroom in the traditional courses like math, science, reading, writing, and so on. Physical activity, again, is important to establish patterns in childhood, and hopefully that carries on to adulthood. Playing, doing, snowboarding or skiing or sledding, being physically active is just going to be important overall for kids. And so whatever those intervention strategies are to get kids more active is going to be beneficial if you can find the one that's actually effective. Currently, a lot of the top-down interventions are less impactful. And what I've found in the research is that if parents are mirroring physical activity to their kids are going to be more likely to be physically active because they're seeing that mirrored by parents or guardians. And so maybe starting with you is going to be an important way to increase physical activity in your kids. What is interesting, though, is that there's been a decline in physical activity during adolescence, and this has happened more rapidly in girls compared to boys. It's tough to determine if this is a biological age thing or if it's a chronological age thing. So, that maturation, if you're becoming more aware of your body and not wanting to get sweaty, or maybe it might be related to physical activity classes in school that are at the beginning of the day, and girls don't want to get as sweaty, so they're like, no, I don't want to do any physical activity. One early bird study found that the decline in physical activity started at 9 years old, and they attributed that decline to low intensity activity, or there was an attributed decline in low intensity activity. So people were just being sedentary and not going for walks or doing light to moderate physical activity. It's unrelated to puberty, but physical activity tracks throughout childhood could be beneficial, so that you can maybe see what that pattern looks like. If you're, again, having your own kids and you want to facilitate physical activity and exercise, doing that yourself and bringing the whole family along can be beneficial, but also limiting some of those sedentary activities to a minimum and having more of an emphasis on physical activity and exercise. That could be beneficial. In this figure, we're seeing the percentage of US boys and girls ages 12 to 15 who are physically active by the number of days per week. And you can see that there is about 10% of boys and girls that don't do any physical activity any days of the week. That's not good. When you combine that with days 1 and 2 days a week, so again, this is not even hitting close to the minimum. This is around 30% of kids between the ages of 12 and 15 aren't hitting at least 3 days of physical activity per week. That's not good. Hopefully we can get more and more kids in this 5 to 7 range. Again, this is about 50% if you're adding all of these together. For boys and girls, maybe 50 to 60%, but 40% are getting less than 5 days a week of physical activity in that 12 to 15 year range. So trying to increase that is going to benefit, again, these kids for their lifetime and can also maybe turn around the healthcare system for these kids when they get a little bit older. All right, we're going to end with sports performance and some special issues with kids. For sports performance in children and adolescents, yeah, it's great to have sports because that can improve growth and maturation. Overall performance is also going to improve as they get older. So you see a lot of parents that are trying to live vicariously through their kids, making their kids train at all hours or do a sport they don't like. That's really not going to be beneficial for them in the long run. Early specialization in one sport reduces that fun feeling that's related to physical activity. And so just give kids the opportunity to explore whatever sports they'd like, find stuff that they do like, maybe it's one or a couple of different activities, and then let them do that and try and do that with them so that you can have, again, a fun connection with your kids. That's going to be the best way to have, again, sport included into their life. If you are wanting to have your kids be the best of the best, you can see on the next 2 slides the United States national records and performance based on age for boys and girls. One thing that you'll notice is that there is a difference that starts to creep up once puberty happens between boys and girls, where the record times for swimming here is going to be leveling off the older that girls get, but continues to decline, which means they get faster as boys get older. Same thing happening for that longer duration swim, 400 meters compared to the 100 meters. And on land, you can see that we're having a difference in speed between boys and girls, and that continues to decline in boys as well as girls for the sprinting side of things, whereas the longer aerobic type of activity is leveling off for girls, where it continues to decline for boys, or the time gets faster for boys. One thing that you'll notice if you're a parent or if you've been around kids, their parents are very aware of the thermal stress that their kids are going to be under. Children typically have that higher surface area to mass ratio, so bundling them up when it's cold is going to be important, especially if you're in the Minnesota area. Also, in the warm environment, they have less sweat that they're producing, so their evaporative heat loss can be lower. Again, being aware that they're playing outside, it's warm, it's humid. You may want to give them breaks so that they're coming in and able to cool off a little bit easier. They're able to have that greater conductive heat loss and gain because, again, they have that greater surface area to mass ratio, but they do have a slower heat acclimation. And so, making sure that you're having water on hand, getting out of the sun, decreasing that radiation, maybe going inside is going to be important. You just should be, though, conservative. So if you think it's been a long time out in the heat, pull your kids back in, have them cool off, and do all that. Or if you think it's been too long in the cold, pull them in, warm them up. That's going to be important. So there's more research that is needed, but just be conservative and try not to go to the extreme with either. And then finally, when we're looking at growth and training, so is this exercise, is this resistance training, is this intensity going to stunt their growth? There's little to no evidence that it affects height in a negative way. So it can actually possibly improve overall size, So you can see the effects on weight and body composition with intensity. As you continue to increase in intensity, you'll have greater changes in weight and body composition that will be beneficial. Peak height velocity at your specific age for your gender is not affected, and the rate of skeletal maturation is also unaffected, as long as you're not breaking growth plates and things like that. Maturation with training, there are effects on markers of sexual maturation, but these are less clear. Again, if you relate this back to what we had talked about in the nutritional chapter with girls, if you're increasing your caloric deficit, you may have, again, that cycle and a menstruation being thrown off. So there are differences that can occur here. If that exercise starts earlier on and they have that delayed menarche where they're not actually having their first period, that's a little less clear. But for the most part, as long as the kids are eating appropriately, having a balanced diet with whatever their caloric expenditure is, then everything is going to be just hunky dory. So hope that shines a little bit more light on kids and the impact of exercise. Kids should be out there getting active, getting exercise, and living their best life. And doing it with your whole family is also going to be a benefit.